some time to join this presentation and this debate. And as Michael said, I have, let's say, a mixed professional background as a researcher and as an activist. Actually, before starting my PhD, I used to work as a campaigner for Friends of the Earth Europe in Brussels. And so the presentation will have both, let's say, an academic and an activist flair, in the sense that I'll tell you the genesis of the concept of the Green New Deal, what its main features are, and why I think it should be grounded in a post-growth economics. But I'll try not to make it to sound too academic and too boring. And I think that we are in a situation that requires quick actions, and I think that the concept, the political discourse of the Green New Deal is a step in the right direction, but we need to radicalize it by taking up some of the demands of the climate justice movements and of the degrowth / post-growth movement. So without any further ado, I'll start telling you a bit about the history of the Green New Deal, which is quite a long history, since it dates back to the 90s. It was then that the concept was first tossed around. The term was coined in some policy papers, but it actually came to the public scene in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008. When some American politicians started using this term to refer to the need to relaunch the American economy in the wake of the financial crisis. And the most famous voice that took up this term was Barack Obama, that embraced the concept on the campaign trail. And once he was voted into office, one of the first measures, one of the first actions that was taken by his administration was to pass a stimulus package, of which a sizable share was devoted to energy efficiency and renewable energy. Subsequently, as the financial crisis started spreading all over the world and becoming a global economic recession, numerous governments and international institutions started adopting the concept of a Green New Deal. In fact, the United Nations Environmental Programme in 2009 released a report titled Global Green New Deal, in which was asking governments around the world to coordinate their stimulus packages and to make them green. The report recommended to spend at least 1% of GDP on green initiatives. However, with the exception of a couple of countries, all the others fell short of this objective. Just to think that the European Union at the time devoted just 0.2% of its GDP to green measures as part of its fiscal stimulus. Subsequently, around the year 2010, the global economic consensus turned away from stimulus and more towards austerity economics. And memorably, at the G20 summit in Toronto in June 2010, global leaders decided to ditch the Keynesian economics and to take a steep turn toward austerity under the banner of growth-friendly fiscal consolidation. Therefore, balanced budgets, deficit hysteria became the dogma of G20 governments, and any talk of a Green New Deal withered on the vine. So the concept went dormant for about 8-9 years, when it was taken up again by climate justice activists in the United States and by some young and let's say radical politicians from the Democratic Party. So around 2018, the term Green New Deal started populating headlines again, but this time around the term was referring to something more than just a green stimulus package. Let's say that this new version of the Green New Deal bears a closer resemblance to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a series of social programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and labor regulations that was enacted in the aftermath of the Great Depression in the 30s. So basically, the key features of the Green New Deal started being public ownership of strategic utilities, social and labor reforms, the need for a just transition, even for a job guarantee. Now, I will go into details of each one of these tenets of the proposal and explain it in greater detail. At this point, just a disclaimer. The term Green New Deal since 2018, when it was used for the first time by Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, has been, over the past 2-3 years, appropriated. The banner of the Green New Deal has been appropriated by so many groups and politicians that it's difficult to agree what it stands on, in the sense that I see the current attempts of co-opting the concepts of the Green New Deal and filling it with all kinds of neoliberal, let's say, policy proposals and ideas as pure greenwashing. So I'm not claiming that what I'm going to talk about tonight under the term Green New Deal is what everybody using this term would agree on. I'm referring now to, let's say, this original understanding of the Green New Deal as it was hammered out in 2018 by climate justice activists. And I think that it's important that we keep in mind what the Green New Deal actually means, because other proposals such as the European Green Deal of the European Commission, I think, fall short of climate action that is in line with what the world really needs at this point. So let's say that the Green New Deal, in a nutshell, we can say that it prescribes an active role for the state in the economy. So in doing so, many economists refer back to Keynes' famous words of advice, and I quote, "The important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are already doing and do them a little better or a little worse, but rather to do those things which at present are not done at all," unquote. So basically, this means fully deploying the power of public investment and coordination in a historic break from the neoliberal dogma that has dominated the public discourse over the past 30-40 years. So the Green New Deal advocates, let's say, takes the view that the ecological crisis is part of a wider social crisis caused by unbridled capitalism. And so the objective of the Green New Deal is twofold. The one is to address the climate crisis, and the other one is to address the socioeconomic crisis, so rising inequality, deterioration of democratic institutions, polarization of the political discourse. So the Green New Deal is not just focused with rectifying, let's say, the relationship between the economy and the environment, but also to rectify the way that society interacts with economic and political institutions. So if we accepted this thesis of the Green New Deal, meaning that the ecological crisis is a colossal failure of the free market, then the first step is to recognize the need for public interventions that go beyond the simple modification of prices, such as carbon taxation and subsidies for green technology. And instead, we should adopt public interventions that impose strict limits on emissions and rigid environmental standards in line with scientific evidence. One example of this kind of command and control measures would be to phase out combustion engine cars by the year 2030, for example. So here you're not trying to nudge consumers by acting on prices, but rather by imposing strict limits and environmental regulations. So we could say that the ecological transition in the eyes of Green New Deal supporters cannot depend on microeconomic approaches such as taxation, when what we actually need is a new political economy. So consistent with these premises, the Green New Deal refuses to reduce the ecological transition to a question of individual lifestyles, which has dominated, let's say, all kind of neoliberal discourses about the green transitions, because this focuses on individual virtuous green lifestyles runs the risk of courting elitism and therefore alienating the majority of citizens. Rather, the Green New Deal presents the ecological transition as fundamentally a collective issue and therefore political. So we can say that the framework of the Green New Deal is to operates by constantly delivering and broadcasting tangible quality of life improvements for the majority of citizens, especially the poorest, the most vulnerable, while transforming the way we produce, consume, and live our lives. So the idea is that the Green New Deal, in order to win a political coalition that can support the advancement of these reforms, needs to offer something to people. It cannot be a purely technocratic discourse based on models, but rather it must be made understandable and it must offer something to people in order to win them over, so to speak. This being said, I'll now delve into some of the constitutive features of the Green New Deal that I sketched out earlier on. I think the core concept of the Green New Deal is the one of environmental justice. And this applies both at environmental justice within societies and around the world. So first of all, we have to ditch the narrative of the Anthropocene that peddles the idea that it's not just that we are all into this together, but actually that we are all equally responsible for causing the ecological crisis. Far from it. In fact, income, wealth, is by far the most important determinant of environmental impact. It doesn't really matter how green you think you are. The truth is, empirical data reveal that if you have surplus money, you end up spending it. The only form of consumption that's clearly and positively correlated with the good environmental intentions is diet. So basically, people who see themselves as green tend indeed to eat less meat and more organic vegetables. But this kind of green attitudes have little bearing on the amount of transport fuel, home energy, and other materials you consume. So data reveals that energy footprints grow with expenditures and, as a consequence, are unequally distributed across society. So among all the countries for which studies have been conducted, on average, the top 10% of citizens by wealth consume roughly 20 times more energy than the bottom 10%. And additionally, as income increases in the top deciles, people spend more of their money on energy-intensive goods, such as faraway package holidays, expensive sport cars, which leads to high energy inequality. Just to give you a figure, researchers found that 187 times more vehicle fuel is used by the top 10% consumers than the bottom 10%. So almost 200 times more energy is used by the richest 10% than the poorest 10%. And across all kind of consumer choices and economic activities, there is a very strong link between between expenditures and environmental impacts. But it is not just that wealthy individuals, wealthy households are the most responsible for driving the ecological crisis. It is also that they are poised to gain the most from climate disrupting activities, since their wealth acts also as a buffer between themselves and environmental vulnerability. I think that the pandemic over the past year has driven this point home to many people. We understand that we are not all equally vulnerable, but depending on our socioeconomic status, we have different means to shelter, to buffer ourselves from at least the worst consequences of the pandemic. There is another observation, which I think, another empirical observation, which goes a long way supporting the argument of the Green New Deal, meaning the long-standing observation that the opulent lifestyles of the wealthier classes influence the less wealthy, basically driving wasteful production and consumption. This is something that is called the Veblen effect, basically this idea of positional consumption, meaning that the more a society, the more unequal a society is, the more positional consumption there will be, meaning that people, in order to distinguish themselves from others, will indulge in more luxury consumption in order to signal to others their socioeconomic status. So an unequal society is an anxious society that resorts to consumerism in order to maintain a sort of packing the social order. So we can observe that in societies that are more unequal than others, also the average ecological footprint per capita is higher. So this gives, this brings us, I think, to an interesting observation, meaning that if we want to decrease emissions and the ecological footprint in our societies, we must tackle inequality. And in a way, as we mobilize people in order to act on inequality, we are gonna gain not just a fairer, a better, let's say, more just distribution of wealth in our society, but also a society in which people suffer less from environmental hazards. So the point here being that there is not just a direct relationship between wealth and environmental impacts, but there is also an inverse relationship between environmental vulnerability and wealth, as I was describing. So basically, this gives the result of a so-called double injustice. I think that this lays the foundation for a strong political discourse based on the concept of fairness, both in economic and in ecological terms. This kind of observations lead pretty naturally, I think, to wondering what are the right policy instruments, the right economic policy instruments to address these issues. And this should lead us to problematize the omnipresence of the carbon tax in, let's say, socio-ecological policy making. In fact, supporters of the Green New Deal think that the carbon tax should not be at the center of our political discourse. And that is because a carbon tax delegates to the laws of supply and demand the shifting consumption habits. And so basically, this is premised on the idea that we are all equally responsible for the climate crisis, and therefore we must all internalize the negative externalities of our consumption habits, regardless of whether this consumption is for luxury goods or for meeting essential needs. So I think that everything I've said so far disqualifies this ideological foundation for this proposal. So we should move past this kind of microeconomic approach focused on the carbon on the carbon molecule that has a regressive and therefore counterproductive effects on the articulation of a progressive environmental discourse. So carbon-centric approaches should be, I think, replaced by wealth-centric approaches. So to resort to the argument that since we are not all equally responsible for this, we are not all equally vulnerable to this, then a redistribution in wealth is the first step necessary in order to, first of all, decrease this positional consumption that I was talking about, but also to finance the public infrastructures that are needed in order to provide people with alternatives to heating their homes and moving around, working and consuming in general. So the idea is that carbon taxation might not be ditched entirely, but we must understand the sequencing of policies as something very important. And I think that the Gilets jaunes protest in France are a trailer that we are doomed to see replicated in many countries around Europe if we don't understand the fact that we cannot tax people for their essential consumption habits if first we don't provide them with alternatives. So how is it possible that we first tax gasoline that many people that live in the periphery of big cities or in rural areas and that have services and workplaces that are located far away from their homes? How can it be that we first tax gasoline rather than, for example, kerosene, the fuel used on planes, when we know that, for example, the purchase of plane tickets is so skewed, and we know that the top 10% of the population tends to basically buy about 70% of flight tickets in most European countries. So we first need to tax wealth in order to reduce inequality and to finance the public services needed in order to provide alternatives to people. Once we have done that, then we can think of trying to nudge the consumption choices of people by using some, let's say, market-based policy instruments. As I was saying before, the environmental justice discourse, the core of the Green New Deal, doesn't just look at within countries' environmental injustice, but also it looks at the global environmental injustice. And that is why the target of the Green New Deal is to achieve decarbonization in the global north, so let's say in OECD countries, by 2030. Because even though it's true that the IPCC recommends that the world achieves carbon neutrality by 2050, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is at the core of climate diplomacy, leads us to attribute a higher burden, let's say, a higher burden in the decarbonization process to wealthy countries that, of course, bears an historical responsibility for pumping most of the CO2 into the atmospheres. So 2030 tends to be the target of the Green New Deal political discourse. And from there, a series of logical conclusions can be drawn, in the sense that we cannot have this kind of gradualist approach, but rather there must be this sort of kind of wartime-like mobilization. That is a metaphor that is very often used in debates about the Green New Deal. But another point I want to make before carry on with discussion of policies is the fact that global environmental justice does not just mean achieving a decarbonization in the global north by 2030, but also problematizing the material intensity of our economies. So this is a point I will discuss more in depth in the latter part of the presentation when I'll be talking about post-growth. But the idea that, of course, while solar energy, wind energy are clean forms of energy, the technology we need to harness this kind of energy is not immaterial, and therefore we need to problematize the amount of, for example, rare earth or in general metals and materials that we import from the global south. So there must be this dimension of global environmental justice front and center in any plan that is worthy of the name Green New Deal, and there must be also international solidarity in pursuing decarbonization, meaning transfer not just of funds, but also of patent-free technology, of patent-free green technology to global south countries in order to help the implementation, the adoption of these technologies in all communities around the world. And then again, I think that the pandemic we are living through drives home pretty clearly the point that we cannot have patented technologies when it comes to challenges that we are all in it together, and that there cannot be any form of safety that global north can reach, neither with the ecological crisis nor with the pandemic, unless everybody in the world has access to this technology, be it green technology to dampen emissions or vaccines. Another core concept of the Green New Deal is the one of a just transition. So basically the labor dimension. The Green New Deal aims to overcome the historic disagreement between the protection of work and the protection of environment. So basically, the proposed strategy of the Green New Deal for work is premised upon the idea that benefits of the ecological conversions need to reach a sufficient number of workers so as to bring together a winning political coalitions. And I think that this is particularly important for gaining the consensus of the industrialized areas where far-right parties are getting the most votes. So if we think of the election of Trump in the US or Brexit in the UK or many other national examples in the EU, we see that most votes to right-wing parties, far-right parties, come from the industrialized areas, where people have seen their traditional occupations, the traditional jobs disappearing over the past few decades and are embittered against this process of globalization. So I think that the Green New Deal can also harness the popular discontent and channel it towards a virtuous political and economic discourse. Truth is that the production and the installation of renewable energy plants, the retrofitting of private public buildings, the repairing of objects and appliances, but also the conversion of agribusiness into small-scale agroecology, are all activities that create many jobs which are difficult to delocalize to other countries, and are also difficult to automate. So I think that these green jobs offer the opportunity of making appealing to many people in our society, in our communities, the fact that we don't need to transition towards a green economy just because otherwise down the line in 50, 100 years time we are gonna be hit by global heating, but also because this can be beneficial to all workers in the economy. This is the proposal for green jobs pertaining, let's say, opportunities in the private sectors. But there is, in addition to green jobs, also another flagship proposal pertaining work in the Green New Deal narrative, which is the one of a job guarantee. So the job guarantee, in a nutshell, is a permanent and nationally funded program that supplies employment opportunities on demand for all those that are capable and willing to work. So this should not be confused with workfare. So it's not the idea that people that are applying for social benefits will be required to do work, but rather that the opportunity of taking up this job guarantee would be on top of public benefits that people receive. So that's why it's voluntary. I want to stress this point to avoid any misunderstanding. So the idea is that there are lots of work in our society that need to be done in order to strengthen social and ecological resilience. And many of these activities cannot be driven by the private sector, since are probably not gonna ensure higher rates of profits. And all these activities have to do with, let's say, social ecological care. So both focusing on the maintenance and repair of the built and natural environment. So just think of soil consumption, think of the need of planting trees to absorb CO2 out of the atmosphere, or strengthening the resilience of ecosystems that are very vulnerable to unpredictable, let's say, weather events, because they've been made more fragile over the past few decades. But also focused on care activities for communities. So education, medical support to aging populations, and community services to many people living in rural areas that don't want to move from the places we live. And I think that this is very important, because as we are bringing back jobs to rural areas, so in a way trying to revert this decades-long trend of, let's say, a rural-urban exodus, this entails also the fact that we needed to have a more diffuse public services in our countries, because there will be a lower concentration of the population in just some big urban centers. So as you can see, all these proposals, I think, have different ways they come together. You bring back jobs to communities, but you also need to bring back services to communities. And it's important that people stays in these communities, because the ecological care work that needs to be done requires the presence of people in these areas, because these are jobs that are not going to be automated, are not going to be offshored, as I was saying, and therefore you need the people to live where the work needs to be done. So installing solar panels, wind turbines, small agroecological farms. Speaking of public services and let's say infrastructural transformation, brings us to I think a core element of the Green New Deal, which is the one of public ownership of strategic infrastructures. And that is because the electrification of the energy system and its decarbonization can be facilitated by bringing strategic sectors for the green transition under public ownership, that it can be nationalized, it can have cooperative ownership. And this derives from the fact that investments in renewables will, or in general in green activities, will most likely bring returns in much longer time frames than private companies expect. And that is why it's important that, for example, municipalized companies or cooperative energy groups operate with lower profit requirements than the private sector. And indeed, I think that goes a long way explaining why still in the world nowadays, the International Energy Agency reveals that 70% of investments in the renewable energy sectors worldwide still come from the public purse. So I think that while some investor-owned utilities are starting to shift to renewable energy, their compulsion to recoup their sunk costs and their obligation to generate shareholder profits continually impede progress. Just the other day, I was reading this interview to the CEO of this Norwegian investment funds, which was saying, in which he was saying that they are looking for opportunities to invest in green sectors. The problem is that the rate of returns that are ensured by these investments are below what their shareholders expect, and therefore there is very little leeway for bringing, I think, these financial institutions into financing, into the, let's say, the financing process for the green transition. But on top of the aspect of financing, I think that there is also an aspect of how can I put it, of general, let's say, management of these public infrastructures, which makes sense that is publicly supervised. After all, clean energy and the low carbon infrastructure necessary to provide it is a public good. And historically, governments have directly provided public goods, such as healthcare, roads, the sewage systems, railways. So in all these cases, it's governments that directly either directly builds this infrastructure or contract the firms to build them. But in all cases, it's not just public money, but it's also, let's say, public institutions that coordinates the construction and operations and decide the rates at which people, at which these, let's say, public services should be provided to people. So just to think of highway tolls, train tickets. So I think that treating the climate crisis as a public infrastructure challenge rather than a private market failure brings a range of advantages that pricing and regulations alone cannot provide. So basically, Public ownership enables longer time horizons that private investors cannot tolerate, and it enables the planning and coordination across sectors of the economy to integrate infrastructure and institutions, so allowing the emergence, let's say, of synergies between different infrastructural transformations. And of course, it gives access also to low-cost public finance. And that's, I think, no coincidence that many progressive governments around the world that are starting, let's say, talking about the Green New Deal, always discuss it in tandem with this idea of having a green public bank. That was one of, I think, flagship proposals of the Labour campaigns in the 2019 general elections, because public funding is going to make the price tag for this transition much lower than it would be otherwise. And of course, these kind of considerations extend not just to the energy infrastructures, but also to other key, let's say, key sectors for the green transition. So water systems, railways, waste recycling, the housing sectors to retrofit the existing housing stock and build a passive public housing, but also for other things like broadband, for example. As I was saying, if we want to relocalize the economy, we need to relocalize also people, and we need access to broadband, because again, as the pandemic is proving, without broadband, it's difficult for people to keep in touch with their families, keep in touch with the public administration, accessing cultural contents, and for, you know, also justify these life choices of moving away from urban centers. An interesting report, I think, that corroborates all these claims was published by the Transnational Institute last year, I believe, in which basically the authors of this report trace about 1,400 cases all over the world where basically public services have been remunicipalized and brought back under local government control after many years of skyrocketing fares, lack of investments both in the quality of the service, in the safety of for consumers, but also in investing for the green transition. I think that what is happening in Texas these days with energy companies not being able to provide a reliable energy to their customers goes a long way, proving what complete deregulation and privatization of these strategic sectors can do. This discussion on public ownership brings me, I think, to one of the most interesting proposals of the Green New Deal, which is the one of a decommodification of public services. So basically, with respect to this, we can say that the Green New Deal narrative argues that climate change is a class struggle because it centers on the material conditions that people face in their daily lives. So it is about the way people move, eat, power, and heat their homes. So in focusing on these sectors, the Green New Deal postulates the idea that we can both decarbonize and decommodify these sectors to create better lives for the vast majority of people. So once again, this is not just an economic plan, but this is also a political discourse. So reclaiming from the market logic and subjecting these key public services to the logic of the commons and of public ownership is an essential step in getting people on board with these proposals. And I will discussing more about this in the latter part of the presentation, about when I'll be telling you about post-growth ideas. And of course, the one of the decommodification of the essentials of life is important, both to democratize the economy, to decarbonize these infrastructures and the way we live, but also to allow people to live decent lives and access to the essentials without necessarily being employed full-time in wage labor. The last point I want to make about the Green New Deal is the proposal of having, let's say, bottom-up forms of democracy, of direct democracy, and in order not to make it this top-down kind of big government exercise. So the idea is to bring people into the decision-making process, both, of course, in the cooperatives that might own and manage many of these infrastructures, but also by democratizing the workplace. So to win social power over the material, over material production. And this is because we know that it is not so much demand that influences supply, but rather it is the concentration of the means of production that determines demand. Even though the concept of course, consumer sovereignty is one of the totem of neoliberalism, we know that few large multinational companies and financial groups decide the direction of the economy. So they decide the activities in which we need to invest, and those that should be abandoned, the regions in which to place factories, and those that must be industrialized, the technologies to use, the contracts to offer to workers, the environmental standards with which production is carried out. So democratizing economic production means, first of all, involving in industrial decision-making all those who must live with the consequences of production choices, meaning the workers who work in factories, who are part of this production process, but also the communities surrounding the plants where production happens. So involving workers and communities into the decision-making process of what to produce. Also because with a fast shrinking carbon budget, I think that as during the first wave of the pandemic, we had to shut down non-essential production. My bet is that we will need to do something very similar with the worsening of the ecological crisis, when we realize that the amount of energy that we can provide through clean energy sources is not going to be enough, and we'll need to prioritize what are actually the goods and services that we need the most to meet the people's needs, rather than, let's say, satisfy the market logic. So I think that involving not just consumers, but also workers and local communities in this decision is very important. I'll leave it at that with my discussion on what the Green New Deal entails, and I'll try in the remaining 15 or 20 minutes just to sketch out why I think that we need to ground the proposal of a Green New Deal in post-growth economics. So the Green New Deal is, after all, a proposal about transforming production, transforming the infrastructure of our societies. But I think we need to problematize also the other side of the equation, meaning consumption. Again, not falling into that kind of lifestyle environmentalism that I was taking aim at the beginning of the talk, but rather focusing on getting past this obsession with consumer society, with this idea that we need to consume more and more because that's where let's say quality of life lays, and that's what the point, let's say, of our civilization is about. But before getting there, before explaining let's say how we can get away from there, I want to start by giving you a figure that sets the scene, I believe, for the conversation we should be having about the challenge of decarbonization and of the ecological transition that we face. If the global economy continues to grow at the usual rate of 2-3% per year, as any economist hopes for, then in the next 30 years, the world will consume as much energy and materials as we did cumulatively for the past 10,000 years. So in the next 30 years, we're going to consume as much energy and materials as we did during the previous 10,000 years, because of course, compound growth. And so this exponential curve that brings us to try to increase by 2-3% per year, which seems a punny, let's say, figure, a growing pie. That's the madness, right, of compound growth. So the thing to grasp here is that the increasing material and energy consumption tracks more or less exactly with the rise of global GDP. So the two, GDP and our material and energy footprints, have grown together in lockstep for many decades. So every additional unit of GDP growth means an additional unit of material extraction. And since the year 2000, actually, the growth of material use has outpaced the growth of GDP. So instead of gradually dematerializing the global economy, we have been rematerializing. And that is partly because of offshoring of much of production, so away from countries in which there was cleaner production standards, and instead that we offshored it in countries where, of course, environmental, just like labor standards, are lower. So this form of labor environmental dumping is driving a rematerialization of the economy. So because GDP growth is driving energy demand up at such a rapid pace, renewable energy is not replacing fossil fuels, but rather it is being added on top of them. So instead of having an energy transition, what we are witnessing is an energy addition. So just think that today the world is producing 8 billion more megawatt hours of clean energy per year than we were doing in the year 2000, 8 billion megawatt hours. That's a lot. That's actually enough to power the whole of Russia, just to give you a figure. But over exactly the same period, economic growth has caused energy demand to increase by 48 billion megawatt hours. So while we have brought into the energy system 8 billion more megawatt hours of clean energy, the energy system has grown by 48 billion megawatt hours. So obviously, what clean energy is doing is just covering a small fraction of new energy demand. So with business as usual growth, the global economy is set to roughly triple in size by the middle of the century. So that's 3 times more extraction and production than we are presently doing. And that inevitably will entail 3 times more energy use. So if it is unimaginably difficult for us to decarbonize the existing global economy in the short time we have left to stay within the remaining carbon budget, it is simply impossible to do it 3 times over. This would require decarbonization rates at the global level of about 12% per year. That's more than 5 times faster than the historic rate of decarbonization. And 3 times faster than most scientists agree that it is achievable even under very optimistic conditions. And remember of what I was discussing about before of global environmental justice, if that 12% figure is for the aggregate of the world, based on this historical responsibility that the global north has, such rates of decarbonization would need to be even higher in the global north. So that's just not feasible based on the current technologies we have. So some recent studies have put forward an incredible amount of empirical evidence proving that the decoupling of economic growth from environmental pressure anywhere near the scale needed to deal with the ecological crisis is not happening. But even more problematic than this is that this very same studies also show that such decoupling appears unlikely to happen even in the future. So the kind of decoupling we have observed, so this decoupling, while in theory we see GDP going up while environmental impacts going down, has been observed only in very specific cases. And when I say specific cases, I refer to either very limited geographical areas or for very limited amount of time or for very specific pollutants while overall environmental impacts increase. So I think that lots of the academic debate that is going on now on this debate of decoupling by cherry picking on some historical examples, say, you see, they managed to decouple growth from, I don't know, waste generation in a canton in Switzerland for a couple of years. Then decoupling is a thing, and then it's possible to generalize it to the whole world for a protected period of time for all environmental hazards. That's just beyond the point. What we need is not just this kind of picking on these statistical oddities, but rather having a clear, I think, grasp of what are the technological opportunities open to us. And I think that decoupling is not one of them, or kind of absolute decoupling to the tune of the decarbonization we need. Another point I want to make, since I was stressing so far so much on energy, is that the vast majority of energy is consumed not by households, but by industry. So the best way to reduce energy use is to focus not on energy itself, but rather on the material throughput of our economy. So it might seem counterintuitive that the solution to the problem of emissions has to do with materials, but actually this is, I think, where the crux of the matter lays. And what's so brilliant about the idea that by downscaling material use, we can also help reducing energy use and reducing emissions is that this is some sort of, let's say, an ecological coherent solution, because it allows us, while tackling the climate crisis, also to tackle the other dimensions of the ecological breakdown, meaning deforestation, biodiversity collapse, overuse of water. So we cannot focus just on the climate when we know that are several the planetary boundaries that we have already overshot. And that's why post-growth tries to take a more holistic approach to the ecological challenges in front of us. Because if we focus just on one at a time, we can actually make some of these planetary boundaries even more endangered while we try to tackle one. So at this point of the talk, I guess you may be wondering how we can ensure that we provide for the essentials of life in the context of an economy that doesn't grow. Well, the truth is that the intervention that matter when it comes to improving human welfare do not require high levels of GDP. And the proof of that is that, for example, the European Union as a whole has a 36% less income than the United States, and yet it beats the US not only on life expectancy, but on virtually every indicator of human welfare, with 36% less GDP. But there are even countries that are usually defined as developing, underdeveloped countries that manage to achieve high levels of human welfare with low GDP per capita. I think that the most interesting example is the one of Costa Rica, a country in Central America, which surpasses the United States on many welfare indicators with a GDP per capita that is only 1/7 the one of the US. This leads us to the question, what explains such remarkable results? Well, the fact is that when it comes to delivering long, healthy, flourishing lives for all, what counts is investing in high-quality universal public services, which are significantly more cost-efficient to run than their private counterparts, and actually have a lower ecological footprint than their private equivalents. The problem is that since the 80s, what we have observed is these endless waves of privatization hitting education, healthcare, transportation, housing, social security in most countries in the world. So social goods everywhere are under attack. And this is a purposeful strategy. The idea is that by making public goods artificially scarce, people will have no choice but to purchase private alternatives, meaning people end up paying to acquire goods that they used to access for free. And what happens when you enclose a public goods that people used to access for free and force them to resort to public alternatives? Well, GDP grows. GDP grows because money changes hands. So what happens is that you create what we may call artificial scarcity. Our ability to provide public healthcare, public education, good social services is still there, but we have enclosed it in order to spur GDP growth. So this form of artificial scarcity and growth create a self-reinforcing loop. To stimulate growth, you need to enclose public goods, as I was explaining now, and to have the means, and for people to have the means to access public goods, then you need to have growth. To have growth, people need to work longer hours and make sure that they have access to wage labor. So this creates a self-reinforcing loop between growth and artificial scarcity. But try to follow me here. My thesis here is that if scarcity is created for the sake of growth, as I just explained, then by reversing artificial scarcity, we can render growth unnecessary. Basically, by the enclosing and expanding the commons, the public goods, we can enable people to access the essentials of life without high levels of income, and therefore additional growth. People would therefore be able to work less without any loss to their quality of life, and therefore also producing less unnecessary stuff, that would lead also to generating less pressure on the biosphere. So while the economy would be smaller in terms of GDP, it would be more abundant in terms of welfare. So in a nutshell, we can say that degrowth, post-growth, calls for abundance in order to render growth unnecessary. So the last, so I hope that by this point I have persuaded you on the fact that our twin crises of ecological breakdown and our breakneck attempts to spur the economy are actually driving a self-reinforcing loop. And once again, I think that the pandemic is proving this very well. We know that we need lockdowns in order to prevent the pandemic, but with lockdowns, the economy doesn't grow. And so what we do, we open up factories again, workplaces again, and this drives another wave of the pandemic that is going to take another hit on the economy. So there is, I think, this very vicious linkage between the economic reasons and the limits that the biosphere is inevitably imposing on society. In the last couple of minutes of the presentation, I just wanted to address a question that is surely in everybody's minds, and that, of course, we can further discuss later on in the Q&A, but it allows me to just clarify that when I'm talking about the needs of downscaling material consumption, this is not applied universally. Of course, there should be a differentiation between countries in which there is at the aggregate level enough consumption. The problem is that it's unevenly distributed. So of course, there are people in our societies that need more income and probably need also more material consumption. But this is not because in our societies we don't produce enough, but rather because this is captured, concentrated at the top. So it's not that we live in a poor world, in poor society, rather we live in unjust societies. And this, of course, at a broader scale, usually brings in the question of the global south. So one of the most common criticism that are addressed to the growth is that it ignores the need for increasing incomes in the global south. But I think that the problem is in the way that the question is usually articulated, because these are the terms of the question, usually. Either we stop the growth machine for the sake of ecological stability, therefore sacrificing the global poor, or we improve the lives of the poor, but sacrifice the ecology we all depend on. This appears as a double bind. Fortunately, I believe there is a way out of this impasse. The key is to recognize that we don't live in a poor world that needs more growth, but rather that redistribution can help us meet everybody's needs, not just in our societies, but also in the world without increasing consumptions. So when we normally think of the global poor, we tend to imagine people who are somehow cut off from the world economy, people who live in backwards, untouched, in backwaters, untouched by globalization, unconnected from the lives of people who live in Europe or North America. But this image gives us a completely wrong impression. The truth is that the poorest 60% of humanity are deeply integrated into the circuits of global capital. They work in the sweatshops of multinational companies. They spend their lives mining the rare earth materials that we depend on for our smartphones and computers. They harvest the tea leaves and coffee beans and sugarcane that most people in the global north consume every day. And in many cases, theirs, so the land from which the oil and coal and gas that is powering the global economy is extracted. It is extracted from areas where the 60 poorest percent of humanity lives. So all told, these people contribute the vast majority of the labor resources that go into the global economy. And yet in return, they receive only about 5% of total global income. By contrast, the vast majority of new income from global growth has gone to the world's richest. So the top 1% alone in the world alone capture 19 trillion of income every year, which represents nearly a quarter of global GDP. So the rich lay claim to a truly staggering share of the income that the global economy generates, which is extracted, as I was explaining, from the lands and the bodies of the poor. So since the year 1980, 28% of new income from global GDP growth has gone to the richest 1%. So this means that nearly 1/3 of all the labor we have rendered, all the resources we have extracted, and all the CO2 we have emitted since the year 1980 has benefited the top 1%. 1/3 of all this extraction benefiting just the top 1%. So it makes really little sense to call for more growth in order to improve the lives of the poor when the vast majority of it just grows straight into the pockets of the already rich. And also because we cannot think that in order to maintain these levels of inequality and at the same time raise the bottom of humanity from poverty, we can keep on growing the economy. A recent study, in fact, found that given the existing rate at which income from growth trickles down to the poor, it will take about 200 years to bring everyone in the world above the poverty line. And to get there, we will need to grow the global GDP to 170 times its present size. So try to fathom this. That means 170 times more extraction and production and consumption than we are already doing. The scale of this is horrifying because in the madness of pursuing this, we will, of course, overshoot all kinds of planetary boundaries. So this as a strategy, so the idea of having global growth as a strategy for ending poverty is a terrible approach, both in social and in ecological terms. It is ecologically insane, I think. So the only way, I think, to move past, to bring people from the poor people from the global south to decent standards of living is the one of redistribution. And I'll leave you with one figure. To bring everyone in the world above the poverty line of $7.40 per day would require about $6 trillion. That's a significant sum on the face of it. But notice that it's only 1/3 of the annual income of the richest 1%. So by shifting $6 trillion of excess income from the richest 1% to the poorest 4 billion people in the world, we could end poverty in a stroke and still leave the richest with average annual incomes of nearly $200,000 per year, which is more than anyone could ever reasonably need to live a good life. So when we think about the growth conundrum from this angle, so let's say the environmental justice and global poverty conundrum from this angle, then the supposed double bind between ending mass poverty and restoring ecological stability melts away and reveals a much easier choice between living in a more equitable society on the one hand and risking ecological catastrophe on the other just to maintain the current levels of inequality. And I believe that if we lived in a true democracy and most people were called to make this kind of decision, they would have little difficulty choosing between the two. I'll leave it at that. I've gone slightly over time, but we still have, I believe, more than 20 minutes for debate and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Riccardo, for your wonderful presentation. For the Q&A, I would have people raise their hands, and then I believe they could unmute themselves and they could maybe ask the questions. I will try to keep a sort of order in the people who can I'll try to keep track of the order of people who raised their hands and thusly try to coordinate the the questions on the floor. I see that Lindsay has been raising her hand since the presentation. If she would want to ask the question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm currently doing a research PhD on degrowth and how local government. I'm a local politician. How local government can play its part in not accepting that growth is the only way that we can fund public services. But I have to say I was a bit disappointed that there was a lot about socialism, and then there was a huge bit, and I will get onto my point, but there was a huge bit about how I got the impression that you don't seem to think that Conservatives are on board with this, and that that Conservatives are by definition capitalists. And that's a huge assumption, and I would argue that it's a misassumption. So please reconsider that, because I'm based in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is basically a conservative country. We've had more conservative governments than we've had socialist. So if you assume that you're only talking to socialists in this, you are missing a huge opportunity to talk to people who are notionally on the right of the political spectrum, but care deeply about the environment and care deeply about global inequalities. So please don't make the mistake of not including people on my side of the political spectrum, because I care very much about this, which is why I'm doing the PhD. So I'm very interested in this, but this is probably the third or fourth online presentation I've heard from organizations across Europe. And there does seem to be a predominance of socialist voices. And please don't think that you're only just talking to socialists or people on the left of the political spectrum. People on my side also want to be included in this. And we're not all avaricious capitalists. We care. We want to know how we can work with the environment, the political and economic environment that the OEC and the OECD left us with the Marshall Plan, and how we can remodel this to work for global fairness. And I don't think the only model is socialism. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Lindsay, for your comments. I was talking about the Green New Deal, and the Green New Deal is a concept that comes from the left, I mean, to put it very bluntly. So I was not, in a way, assuming that there cannot be, let's say, a degrowth discourse that comes from a conservative, let's say, traditional political philosophy, but the Green New Deal, for intents and purposes, is a concept that has emerged in, let's say, in the hummus of democratic socialism. And therefore, in my analysis, even though I've, of course, been willing to engage with the concept of the Green New Deal from any party would arise, it comes from the left. So my research and my proposal focused on thinking how growth can interlocute, can enter in a conversation with the proposal of the Green New Deal. And I didn't choose myself that the Green New Deal would come from, let's say, that part of the political spectrum. So if we had just discussed of the growth, I would agree that if I just, let's say, given it a leftist perspective, it would have been skewed. But what I was trying to relay to you, what I was trying to share with you were the findings of my research. And I think that the concept of the Green New Deal comes, I think it's grounded clearly in socialism. And I do believe that some of the proposals that are part of the Green New Deal can be perfectly supported by conservatives. I think I'm less familiar with the Anglo-Saxon political system, of course, but where, you know, it's bipolar, right? You have a majoritarian political system. Italy, for example, the country I come from, has built its welfare state under conservative governments. But these conservative governments were grounded in, let's say, Christian democratic political tradition. So while the liberal center was opposed to this, there were collaborations between Christian Democrats and socialists in setting up forms of public ownerships, forms of welfare state, of wealth redistribution. So I do not believe at all that conservatism is automatically antagonistic to these ideas. I do believe that neoliberalism is, but I do not think that the political philosophy of conservatism is. The Green New Deal, once again, I think that what I try to do with my research is to open up a channel of conversation between Green New Deal supporters, activists, and the degrowth activists. And the reason why I'm focusing on this is because I do not believe that there is a natural interlocution going on between them. So I do not think that degrowth can only speak to them. I think the Green New Deal is the most interesting political discourse out there. And as soon as I see a conservative political party embracing these ideas, I'll be very interested in exploring this kind of conversation. But so far, unfortunately, I haven't encountered it. I hope that clarify at least a bit the angle from which I approach this discussion and my research in general.
I see Sine has raised her hand.
Yes, well, thank you for your interesting lecture. I was wondering if you had read the European Green Deal already, and what are your thoughts on the European Green Deal, and what do you think is missing?
Okay, sorry, I was trying to find the Zoom window. Yes, I've been looking into the European Green Deal, and I believe that it falls short of many of, let's say, the yardsticks set by the Green New Deal. I see it very much as an attempt to co-opt the Green New Deal discourse. I think that the elements that are missing are especially those pertaining global environmental justice. So I haven't seen any real problematization of the fact that IPCC targets should be then modulated based on the country in question. And also because there is very little discussion, I think, of within countries environmental justice, but also because the European Green Deal, I think, is seen as this opportunity to relaunch the European economy without questioning, let's say, neoliberalism. It's, for intents and purposes, I think, a sort of attempt at enclosing the new investment opportunities and the new, let's say, infrastructure transformations that are needed for the green transition. So we just see private players as the drivers of this transition, and we don't think of how we can democratize ownership and how we can bring these infrastructures under also democratic decision-making processes. And I think also the fact that austerity measures are not questioned reveals all the tenuity, let's say, of the European Green Deal proposal, because in a way, lots of the funding, I have the figures, I will need to pull them up. I've written something about it, so I can share the link later on. So if you look at the figures, good good share, a good chunk of the financing should come from member states. But at the same time, the austerity, let's say, measures that most of the countries have been implementing for years in order to meet, let's say, the deficit spending targets, basically force them to need to cut some of the expenditures in order to finance the green transition. So, as I was saying, the Green New Deal is not just focused on the environmental crisis, but also on the socioeconomic one. And if instead you're asking European governments to cut welfare spending in order to finance the green transition, well, let's say you are doomed, I think, to further corroborate these antitheses between environmental and social goals. So I think that the European Green Deal doesn't meet the requirements of being defined. I think a Green New Deal, is it a step in the right direction? Yeah, there are some interesting, of course, proposals here and there, and it has opened up maybe the political debate more. The money part, 37%, if I'm not mistaken, of the Next Generation EU funds will need to be channeled to green investments in line with the European Green Deal. So let's say there is an awareness of the let's say the importance of this kind of themes in the public discourse, but I don't think that they have found a satisfactory answer with respect to these. And it also just complicated my work much more, because now when I say Green New Deal, many people think of the European Green Deal. So I need every time to start my talks clarifying why that is not a Green New Deal.
Okay, I saw Mario had raised his hand, but he lowered it. Do you still have a question, Mario, or is the...
Sorry, did you call on me?
Yes. Did you?
Sorry, I'm just picking up my pizza. Yeah, so basically I had two questions, but since the webinar is about the Green Deal, my first question was about population, but then the second question, because it's more geared toward the Green Deal, what is your take on the circular economy in general, since it is a big component? Do you see opportunities there? Is it basically just business as usual type of thinking that could lead to, potentially more production? Yeah, what's your take on that?
All right, thanks, and lucky you for the pizza. All right, well, I mean, so as for the first question on population, I mean, it's a big discussion, but I think that in many, let's say, traditional, I wouldn't know how to describe them, let's say, in a form of traditional mainstream environmentalism, the population issues was often front and center. And why, of course, it's not lost on me that the more people there are in the world, the more aggregate consumption happens. I think that a very important progress, step in the right direction we made over the last few years, especially with the climate justice movement, is the one to move this question away from, let's say, contextualize it, in the sense that when we observe, and all the data I've given you tonight about the inequality in consumption, I think that it's a very slippery slope to start discussing about population. For example, when we know that with just one flight, Rome to London, a person emits more CO2 than most people in most Central African countries do in the course of the entire year. At that point, the discussion of, but birth rates are much higher there than they are in Europe loses, I think, its validity. Does this mean that we should kind of like ignore the fact that population is a factor in the equation? No, we should not. but the measures to, let's say, bring about demographic transitions that are ethical act upon, let's say, a very long, what do you call it? Let's say it takes a long time to bear effects, you know? So we already know that since the 70s, global birth rates have been going down. So the human population is gonna peak much sooner than we thought, and they're actually gonna start decreasing before the end of the century. And of course, we know that the measures to do that is women empowerment, access to contraceptives, family planning. So these are measures that bear fruits, but over a longer period of time. Since facing the ecological crisis is a race against time, we need to act upon the levers that we can ethically maneuver now, and that can bear effects in a time frame that is in line with the challenge at hand. And therefore, in this equation, so usually environmental impact is the result of the interaction between size of the population, consumption levels, and technology used. So let's invest on R&D for improving technology. Let's, of course, empower women so that they can take in their hands family planning. And we know from data that this means also a decrease in birth rates. But the only element in which we can act with speed and that can actually change things in a time frame that is suitable is consumption. So that's why I focus so much on that, and I think we all should. About the circular economy, the concept of a circular economy is of course desirable. As I was discussing before, I think good employment opportunities can be created in the maintenance of objects and the repairing and the recycling. So I do believe that the economy can be made much more circular than it is now. But I think that wishing away our problems just by hoping that we can turn the economy into full circularity is a dream, or rather a nightmare, because the economy is entropic, meaning because of the second law of thermodynamics, of course, you cannot recycle energy, and also a good share of materials used cannot be recuperated and recycled. So most recycling is actually downcycling. So of course, this is something easy to understand. If we want the economy to grow, we cannot think that we can just keep it circular, right? Because we would be hoping that in a way we can increase our material consumption while maintaining stable the resources that feed, let's say, the production process. So the economy can be more circular, but we cannot have an entirely circular economy because the economy is entropic. So I think that, of course, it's something that should be explored. There are some opportunities there. But being proposed as the holy grail, I believe it's just because it's something. Let's say it's a cop out.
Okay, so maybe Ellen could ask her question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Super interesting. I was curious about your thoughts about the connection between a Green New Deal without growth and MMT, modern monetary theory, specifically regarding like green financing, but also more in general in terms of the job guarantee that they propose.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, that's an aspect I didn't cover in the discussion because, yeah, it would have taken up lots of time. I think that disentangling the Green New Deal from MMT is difficult because the idea was born out of, let's say, circles in which MMT holds a very strong sway. Basically, even the idea of a job guarantee, I wanted to mention it in the talk, the idea goes back actually to Minsky, to the 30s, so it's not a new idea, it's been around for long. And now, of course, we can try and remodulate it to make it green, to focus on socio-ecological resilience, as I was saying, but it's grounded in modern monetary theory. I think modern monetary theory can be very useful in terms of the transition, because it allows us, I think, to sidestep, at least at first, a form of, let's say, redistributional question, in the sense that we know we need huge investments that, as I was arguing, should be public. But at the same time, in order, of course, if you stick to the idea that spending should match revenues, or rather revenues should match spending, at that point, of course, you're faced with a constrained public budget. And we know that changing revenues, increasing revenues for a country, so remodulating income, wealth taxes, consumption taxes, is a lengthy process, because usually it's also the result of a political debate. So this would postpone, for all intents and purposes, the, let's say, finding of financial resources to be devoted to the Green New Deal. So I think MMT allows us to sidestep this. Just print as much money you need to finance this. And then, of course, at some point, we will run into inflation. Who knows? But at some point down the line, especially if you embrace, an idea of like post-growth, right? If you don't grow the economy at a certain point, inflation is going to start occurring. But at that point, of course, you'll be faced with a redistributional question: who is going to bear the brunt of inflation, of a loss of value of money? At that point, you have gained time. You have started, making this investment. So I see it also in terms of strategy, something important. Needless to say, this is not an opportunity. This is not something that in Europe we can at least debate with the same freedom, so to speak, that you can do in North America or in the UK, for that matter, for the simple fact that most EU countries are not monetary sovereign. Now, we do know that with quantitative easings, even forms of debt monetization, you may call them, that the ECB has been running for some time. For all intents and purposes, that's quite in line with MMT. But I think that there are, of course, limits to how much we can resort to that. I'm actually writing a paper with the same scholars. I wrote the previous one, the one we are discussing tonight. So Yorgos Kallis and Jason Ickel, looking at financing strategies for a Green New Deal. And so we, of course, also engage with the whole MMT question. So it's research I am doing, and hopefully I'll publish a paper soon where I'll delve into greater detail into these very, very interesting questions. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, perhaps two more questions. Birger, you're up next, but I saw that in the chat, Harry posed the question, what levers do you see as most open for social and ecological transformation? So the municipal level, the state, the commons, etc.
I think that another added value that the Green New Deal brings to, let's say, the environmental debate, even the environmental movement, I would say, is the one to, as you have understood by now, bring the state back into the discussion. Because historically, I think the environmental movement has focused very much on the international dimension, so climate diplomacy, binding treaties, and on the local level, right? Think global, act local. And there was this missing link of the state. I won't get into the discussion why that is, but I think the Green New Deal is bringing back this missing link in a way, because while we still need the binding agreements at the international level, and why we still need local actions, as I was detailing, the thinking about the green transition as a public good challenge inevitably brings up the question of who is the social actor that has the ability of act on, let's say, institutional levers that are powerful enough to guide this transition. And this is not just in the investment and the building of public infrastructure, but also, for example, all the welfare measures I was discussing. If we do know that we need wealth redistribution, at that point, that needs to be done at the national level, because tax policies, fiscal policies are still very much in the hands of the national governments. again, there are many things that the local communities can do now, even from the so historically Degrowth also is very much focused on the local dimension. So what I've been trying to do with my research, again, of bringing these two communities into a conversation, is also because I think that we're thinking at different institutional levels that I don't think are antithetical to one another, but rather they are complementary, or they should be complementary. So there are interesting, I think, steps in trying to do this. And just to give a reference to everybody so you can look it up, it's what the city of Amsterdam has been trying to do now, trying to bring the concept of the donut, the one developed by Kate Raworth, into policy making at the municipal level. So there is actually a group of researchers that are trying to inform decision-making at the local government level in Amsterdam based on the principles of the donut, which is very much in line with the growth and post-growth. I see them as, let's say, as schemes. This is what I can say off the top of my head, what comes to mind.
Just to ask my question, because it builds on this one. What could be the role of grassroots movements actually to accompany this? Because does it has to be a top-down approach, or is there enough room for bottom-up and grassroots movements?
I would say absolutely. First of all, because the concept per se comes from grassroots movements. So while they are reclaiming in a way the state, so they realize that the levers that they were focusing on before were like not sufficient. So I think they started to reclaim the state. So it absolutely comes from climate justice movements, grassroots movements. So I think they have a big role to play. And then, of course, let's take an example, the historical example of the New Deal. The New Deal was not the result, was, let's say, not entirely or just the result of an enlightened administration, but rather the result of stronger social conflicts happening in the US in the 30s. So while, of course, the Green New Deal tries, let's say, to bring together the most, can I say, progressive, enlightened, let's say, parts of the institutional elites and of the economic elites, into, let's say, an attempt of reforming capitalism or moving past it. It depends, you know, how much on the red spectrum we go. In the end, it's only social conflict, I think, that can drive these, that can strengthen, that can radicalize these claims. And that's why at times I encountered activists that rejected the Green New Deal for not going far enough. And what I tell them is that we should not reject it, we should hijack it, because it's a terrain of struggle. As I was saying, the European Commission has appropriated this concept and watered it down. Well, then we can do the same in the opposite direction. We can strengthen it and we can radicalize what we mean by Green New Deal. So I absolutely think that the true drivers of change is gonna be grassroots movements and the people, because it's important that this is, let's say, a democratic attempt of reclaiming also the discourse on the ecological transition that so often is presented in purely technocratic, techno-solutionist terms. So I think there is a big role for grassroots movements to play.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, the only thing remaining for me is to thank Riccardo for his incredible presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your views, for sharing your time. I found it very, very interesting and motivating. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming and for sharing in our evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.